Everyone, welcome to this live. I want to talk today about communication with avoidantly attached partners, whether they're fearful avoidance, dismissive avoidance, really taking the time today to talk about how you can communicate with these individuals in a way that's healthy, assertive, and in the extreme cases, leading into the realm of setting very rigid boundaries that may include ultimatums. But of course, that is a category that I will discuss at the back end of this conversation because I don't want to start there. That's not the purpose of this. I also want to start this live by saying that when it comes to these dynamics, the one thing I urge, regardless if you were dating someone who is anxiously attached as well too, is if your relationship is defined by the other person's emotional instability, that means you're in a relationship of control, essentially a trauma bond, and you are also not able to have a healthy functioning relationship. I will talk more about what that means in a minute, but the key thing I just want to stress is that if your relationship is one where you don't feel that you can actually have a functioning relationship, it does not feel safe because you feel like if you bring something up, the other person's going to react in a volatile manner, might be high time to question whether or not you actually want to be in a relationship like that. But I'll talk more about that in a minute. As always, if you have any questions for me, feel free to put them in the question mark box below. I'm going to ramble for a bit, talk about this topic, and then at the end, if I have time before the hour, I'll do some Q&A. All right, let's dive straight in. So leading off what I was just saying before that is when it comes to relationships, I think many of us have grown up in dynamics where we didn't even realize we were in emotionally unhealthy family environments, right? If you've got a mum or a dad, a parent who is essentially acting in a way where they rule the roost with their emotional volatility, or they're incredibly cold, dismissive, and not also very good at providing a safe space, it can mean that for many people, they often have grown up learning to bend themselves like pretzels, not set the volatile person off, and also not do a very good job of being able to feel safe in that space. Because when you're a kid, right, you don't really have any options. You don't have the option of being able to protect yourself much of the time. You don't have the option of being able to get an additional parent to replace the emotionally volatile ones. And you're in a place where for a large chunk of your life, you could be conditioned to just putting up with crap that you shouldn't have to put up with. I'm going to take the time now just to say that when it comes to healthy communication with a reasonably grounded person who can communicate and also work through their own triggers, you're going to be fine in terms of being able to have, adult conversations. People are going to get triggered, regardless of whether they're healthy or emotionally unstable. But the thing is that a lot of the tools and tactics we talk about in therapy, the golden standard of communication, using eye language, using non-violent forms of communication, will work with people who actually have the skill set to work through this and don't take things personally. But if you try that approach with someone who's more emotionally unavailable or emotionally unstable, emotionally unhealthy, good luck, because often they don't have the skill set for it. And I'm going to talk more about what that means at the very back end of this conversation. But all I want to just delineate and say is you can learn all the techniques in the world. Learn how to speak like a champ, explain yourself. And if that other person is committed to understanding, fuck that shit. I'm afraid some people in this life are just not worth you trying to explain yourself in the most pristine, articulate way. They will never get it, especially when they're triggered and they're also emotionally in a bad way. And I know some people might come here and be the narcissist brigade and say, well, that means they're all narcissists. No. Emotionally unavailable, emotionally immature people can be narcissistic in that they're like adolescents. They can be adolescents in the way in which they relate to you. Just remember that someone's biological age does not determine their emotional age and their capacity to actually take on information without getting threatened by having their ego bruised. A lot of people do not like, feeling like suddenly things are being attacked to them. And also vice versa. People don't want to have, people come at them from their triggers. So I want to take this moment just to say that if you're someone who, for example, might be going through a triggered episode where you are feeling really angry, sad, volatile, and your partner has maybe done something to cause this, whether it be a small or a large action, I want to just make it very clear and say it's not your partner's responsibility entirely to help you through that. You, the individual, needs to be able to work through your trigger, that emotional experience that you've just had, and maybe relay that information to them in the hopes that you're able to collaboratively work through it. It is not your partner's responsibility to take on all of that. For example, if you feel offended by the fact that your partner has said something, off the cuff about, say, let's just paint an example. Let's say you and your partner are discussing your backstories. You're listening, you're having a chat, talking about, your family upbringing, your history together, and then all of a sudden, your partner just excuses themselves to go to the toilet. You get upset because you feel like they've just abandoned you. The unhealthy way of handling this approach would be to just scream and shout at them and say, you abandoned me, you triggered me when you left the conversation to go to the bathroom. I don't think you really care. Your feelings are valid. The way you're approaching it, not valid. You can't just attack someone from a place of hurt like that, because then it's not going to be productive. And essentially what this creates is a dynamic where the other person feels like they're stepping on eggshells. It feels like they can't actually speak up or do anything without rocking the boat. And that's the foundation that can get set as part of a trauma bond. That example is probably more in line with someone who's more of a fearful avoidant or an anxious attacher. But the point simply is to say is that, that is not the healthy way to go about it. A better way to go about it might be to say to that person, hey, it's not you. When you went to the bathroom outside of the conversation, I did start to feel a bit triggered. It's my stuff. I need to work through it. But, I just wanted to let you know, because if I'm feeling irritable, I don't want to put that on you. I was just hoping that maybe we could have sat down and continued this conversation, but I know when you got to go, you got to go. I appreciate that. It's just a me thing. That way it's a bit more civil and you can work through it. That's just one bit of delineation that I wanted to make, because I think a lot of people think that just because they're triggered, they have a right to speak up for their feelings. And I'm like, yeah, but the way you do it is ultimately more important than just speaking up about it, because we don't want to blast people and be like, you've done this, you've done that. But we'll get into that more in a minute later. Let's dive into the conversation regarding how to communicate with people who have an avoidant attachment. So let's start this. I'm going to do this based on the phases: dating, in a relationship, and burnout, because there are very key distinctions between when you're freshly dating someone who's avoidantly attached, when you're in a relationship with an avoidant attacher, and when you're at that stage of being like, should I stay or should I go? So let's talk dating. The world of ours is filled with beautiful avoidant attachers who will provide the most incredible chemistry and connection you will ever have in your life. And I'm here to say that, frankly, when it comes to the dating stages, this is a time for due diligence, being very self-sufficient, and also being very mindful of your intentions in dating. In the early stages of dating, it is very easy, especially if you're younger and you maybe haven't had a lot of dating experience, to get caught up in the in the oxytocin rush of being with someone early on in those dating phases. So one thing I would highly recommend is that if you are meeting someone new and you're also wanting to find out, generally speaking, what their intentions are, to at least explicitly state yours early on. Frankly, as I've discussed many times, many avoidant attachers are very good at discussing their intentions, and some of them will either go one of two ways. They'll say, yes, I am looking for a relationship, green flag, if that's what you're also looking for. Or, yeah, cortisol does come later. Or they'll say things like, I don't want to rush things. I just want to go with the flow. Now, for those of you that want to go with the flow, more power to you. But I just want to be very clear. At this particular juncture, you're not going to convince the let's go with the flow crowd to be in a relationship with you if that is their mindset. They are clearly telling you they are not interested in being in a relationship. If that changes for whatever reason, they better have a damn good explanation for why that actually is, and that's for them to figure out down the line too. Maybe they need to say, listen, at first I thought I only wanted to go with the flow, but I've realized over time that actually my feelings have changed. Can we talk about it? That'd be ideal if they said that. But more often than not, if you start to ask for a title, if you start to ask, what are we doing? The tendency for these people is to backpedal very hard, and also to not want to double down on anything because it feels like control for them. So just putting it out there, saying, be very mindful of what you say to a person at that particular point, and you may have to reevaluate and see, is this worth continuing to invest time with this person? So that's that thing. Now, for the former category, where they're intentionally laying out, I want a relationship, I want to make it very clear that just because someone says they want a relationship does not mean they have the capacity to be in a relationship. It's wonderful when someone is very clear about what they want. However, One thing that often marks a budding situationship or relationship with a avoidant attacher is that sometimes their behavior and their actions start to get really, really confusing even early on. If you find that when you're starting to date these individuals, you've had like a few good months where everything's been amazing, sex is great, communication perfect, everything's feeling good, and then you feel a shift start to come up, and you also feel in your gut that they're starting to pull away. Dates get postponed, you see that they're not replying as frequently as they did. They're telling you things like, oh yeah, I'm just busy with work. Now is not the time to try and rationalize in your head, oh yeah, I guess they're really busy because they work in a law firm. I guess being a doctor means they're seeing tons of patients. I shouldn't be so needy. I'm going to tell you the complete opposite. Your needs do matter, and if you're in a situation where you feel as though they're starting to pull away from you and they're not actually wanting to own their own behavior, because I can tell you now, this is not the time to just let them run away with the relationship that you're creating. I would highly recommend saying something along the lines of, hey, just wanted to hear where your head and your heart's at. I feel like, everything was going great, but I'm sensing a shift. Keen to hear where your head and your heart's at with this. They may tell you things like, oh, I'm fine, we're good, nothing to worry about. But if you see that there's no change made even after a week, I think the writing is on the wall at that stage. Many of these individuals can slow fade out of a situationship or relationship altogether, because they don't want to be the bad person by breaking it up. So I'm just here to say, please be very careful at this particular stage not to have too much hope unless they're able to come back and work through it. I've actually heard from a lot of people who are avoidantly attached, particularly the milder ones, is that the more humble they are to being accountable can often mean they are actually called out on their stuff, and it's like, oh shit, you're right, I did actually say that I wanted a relationship and I can see I'm doing that thing where I'm pulling away. So if you even bring it up in a way where it's like, hey, last time we spoke, I brought up how I was feeling a bit uneasy about where we were at with, where we're going with dating. I just wanted to, say, look, I still feel like things are a bit distant. I remember you mentioning that you wanted a relationship. Keen to hear what's going on because I feel like this isn't really relationship behavior. Totally fine if you say that for round 2. At round 3, I'm a big fan of 3 strikes you're out. I think at that point you can be like, I gotta go. Like, this isn't doing it for me. I want to take a moment here to say that I know a lot of people in the early stages of dating can get a lot of fear. They can get a lot of fear around, will I ever find someone who treats me this well again? Will I ever find someone who makes me feel, this way again, who's this emotionally available? And I'm here to tell you, frankly, on one hand, yes, you absolutely can. 2, that scarcity thinking can be the bane of dating because you get so caught up with a sunk cost situation where you just end up sticking around with someone who may not be able to deliver what you're looking for. And 3, our mind has a tendency to start making all kinds of crazy rationalizations for why we should stick around in certain, dynamics when it's not good for us. So please check your thinking because it's very easy for anxiety, fear, scarcity to enter the equation when it's not really helping you to actually realize this probably isn't serving my needs and I need to do something to help me about it. So that's another huge thing just to be very mindful of because it's very easy for you to start making excuses for this person without speaking up for yourself. You will find other people who are able to at least last longer than a month in dating. You will find people where you're able to actually work through their stuff early on and commit to being in a relationship with you. And frankly, if they're not able to be, open to humility, to be open to feedback, I just say that, when it comes into that I would just say, look, at this stage, I would just be like, weigh up your options and see whether or not this is something that's worth even investing in at this particular point in time. So that's all I'm going to say there. Finally, I just want to say on this point of dating that you can't convince someone to stick in a relationship with you if they're not able to do it for themselves. You could have the most incredible connection ever, but the fact of the matter is that if they're scared, an avoidant attacher is not going to fight for the relationship. So please bear in mind that, you can have an incredible soulmate-like connection with this person, but if they don't want to take charge of themselves, the fact of the matter is that your connection means absolutely nothing in the face of their anxiety of getting close. So just putting that out there. All right. Moving over into the relationship land where things are getting a bit more serious and a bit more exciting for everyone involved too. So I will define this stage as you've been dating now for, a few months and you've officially put a title on it and you're discussing, things for the future. You know, you're making plans together, you're building a life together. And we want to talk about how to bring things up with an avoidant person when you're actually dating them in an official relationship. One of the gentlest and best ways to actually go about having healthy conversations and confrontation with a partner, having the hard conversations, is, in my experience, actually doing an activity with them. My experience often is that when it comes to being in a relationship with an avoidant attacher, it can be very hard to have a sit-down conversation in a home because frankly, it's never fun to have these conversations. It's like pulling teeth for both parties. But if you're out in the open, doing an activity like going for a walk and just, having a conversation, talking about your stuff, I find for the avoidant attacher, they feel less pressure and less inclination to run because it feels less threatening for them because their mind can be preoccupied with other things that are going on, so they don't feel that same level of intensity. To sort of build your way up to this, the way I would normally do it, and I tell this to my clients, is listen, you could say to your partner, hey, babe, I really love, all the time we're spending together. A few things have come up for me that I'd love to discuss, that are important for the integrity of the relationship. Can we have a chat about it maybe on the weekend and go for a walk and discuss? Just say it like that. And if they say yes, amazing. They say no, well, that's unfortunate. And at that point, you might want to double down and be like, look, I think this is really important for our relationship. And I feel like if we don't talk about it, it could impact the integrity of this relationship. If they continue to say no, take that, at face value. And that's, something for you to consider, which is, can I accept the fact that my partner doesn't even want to have these hard conversations with me about, what it is that we're talking about and actually setting a date for it. So just putting it out there and saying, be very mindful of that. The other thing that I would say is that when you go into having a conversation with an avoidant partner about anything like this, I want to preface this by saying avoidant attachers, regardless of whether they're fearful or dismissive, have a very, very, very high sensitivity to perceived criticism, blame, and feeling judged. As a consequence, my one biggest thing that I would say to you, and this is something that I've heard from a lot of my mates and colleagues who date avoidant attachers, is preface what you're about to say before you go into the conversation by saying something like, hey babe, listen, what I'm about to say is not intended to come across as criticism, as judgment towards you, your character. It is really just about things that I've noticed in terms of behavior. Do you have the bandwidth to have a conversation about this? The reason it's important to give them that consent is because that then at least gets them in their mind to be more open and vulnerable to have that conversation. Otherwise, for a lot of the avoidant attachers, it's like they've got their fists up to their face and they're just prepared to just sort of deflect or not engage with what you're talking about. Hopefully, by having that preface, they're more open to the feedback and open to hearing what's going to be said. So that way you can then have a conversation where you're like, listen, babe, for instance, I love you. Like, I really enjoy everything that we do together. One thing that has been coming to my mind is the way in which we maybe communicate with each other about expectations around, say, going on holidays together. I know that you've mentioned that, work is tight for you right now. And I know that you are really busy with work. I get that. I'm not here to tell you what you should do with your schedule. That's yours. That's totally fine. However, at times I do feel really lonely that we don't actually have significant dates together. In fact, I feel like there's been a marked drop in our amount of interactions together since we got into a relationship. So with that in mind, I'm just wanting to find out if there's a way in which we can try and have more intimate time together, even if it's just, a couple of hours on the weekend. That would really mean a lot to me. That's a bit of a gentle example, but the point is, better to bring this sort of stuff up when it's bothering you. This leads me now to talk about a few key foundational things about why you'd be in this situation and healthy communication or nonviolent communication. One, if you are in a relationship with an avoidant attacher, it's quite easy when it's not going great to feel lonely, bitter, resentful, because it can make you feel like even if you are on the surface part of a great relationship, you will often feel this sense of loneliness and isolation within your relationship when they start to pull away for one reason or another. So it's really important to understand that when you are dating these individuals, if you start to feel that sense of isolation and loneliness creeping in, where you feel as though they're pulling away and you also feel like you're just a passenger in the car that they're driving and the relationship is starting to be on their terms, please acknowledge that. because it's not fair for you and it can cause you to become incredibly passive aggressive, or worse, just ignore that feeling altogether and start doing all this busy work to not actually deal with the elephant in the room, which is the fact that your relationship has now just been taken over by this person's anxiety and they're not willing to come to the table to discuss this. So that's one thing. Secondly, healthy communication pro tips. In a lot of our communication practice that we teach our clients, we often talk about how it's important to phrase things with I statements, meaning I feel this, I have noticed that, I have seen this behavior, etc. Because the minute you throw in you to the sentence, particularly at the beginning, and say, you did this, you did that, you triggered me, it becomes more of an accusation and people are more inclined to be defensive rather than take that feedback on. That's just a general tip. And that's why I think it's really important to bear in mind that when you are communicating with these folk, as with anyone, to just be very mindful of one, who you're talking to, two, how you go about this communication, and three, being very mindful of the language that you're using and how it can come across. Generally speaking, if you were to say this sort of stuff to the average person, I don't think they'd particularly mind. In fact, I think they'd be like, yeah, that's totally fine. But circling back to what I said at the beginning of this live is, if you, the person who's having this conversation with someone, is engaging with an individual, regardless of their attachment style, where they're just committed to misunderstanding, they're taking everything personally, you could be the most amazing communicator, but I can tell you, when someone's emotionally dysregulated and getting angry with you and they don't want to take on what you're saying, I think that's, a point where you need to realize this person's not available for that kind of communication. And we'll discuss what that means in a minute. So we'll do that in just a hot second. But a positive sign, if the relationship is moving forward, is if the avoidant attacher is taking on this feedback and they're starting to commit to changes to working on this sort of stuff with you. It is very tempting to try and also control their behavior. For instance, if, for example, they're smokers, drinkers, addicts of some nature, it's very tempting to try and control their behavior by taking away their cigarettes, throwing away their bottles of alcohol, whatever it may be for them. And I want to let you know that if you're engaging in that kind of behavior, one, it's a trauma bond, two, it's codependency, and three, you really need to speak to someone about it, because that is not healthy. The other person needs to know how their addiction issues are affecting you. And I'm going to say it now. When an avoidant attacher or anyone is an addict, their first love is their addiction. It ain't you. So if that bothers you enough, which frankly it should, you might need to speak to someone about this to really work through it, because it is not your responsibility to manage their addictions. And if you are doing that, you're going to cause yourself a great deal of harm down the line as well too, because then you become a caregiver and it's not really helpful whatsoever. So please bear in mind, if you are in a relationship with an addict who's active of any kind, I don't care if they're smoking twice a week versus twice a day, if it's bothering you enough, it's bothering you and you have every right to bring it up. Now I think with that out of the way, I also want to make another point here, which is really crucial, which is when you are having these conversations discussing with avoidant attachers, what's been bothering you, what's been affecting you, it can be very easy sometimes for the avoidant attachers to go, oh, yes, no, I'll do better next time. And they're very good at apologizing without actually doing anything about it. They might be very slow in terms of actually responding to some of these requests. They might actually be very gradual to the point where they don't actually start doing anything about what you've just said. They might just be incredibly snail-like in their growth. And this is where I've had to have very hard conversations with clients and be like, can you put up with this person's rate of change? Many of us are playing a game of tennis where, frankly, we're at a position where we need to be batting with someone who's more at our level. And sometimes we're engaging with someone, regardless of their attachment style, who's batting at a junior level in terms of emotional availability. If that person is not committed to their growth, is not wanting to take accountability for their stuff, they're clearly not in enough pain or also in enough of a situation where they're willing to grow and change. And you have to then get to a place, which is very hard for us, I'm going to be honest, of having radical acceptance around the situation. Can you live with a partner who is not committed to change? Are you going to be someone who is, happy where your partner may be dragging their feet and still living like they belong at their mum's or their dad's place rather than actually being a grown-up adult and wanting to take charge of themselves? Some people have cemented themselves like barnacles where they will not budge at all until they're in enough pain and do so. And that leads me on to now talk about the third phase of things, which is a stage that I hope no one gets to, but I guarantee most people who are listening to me probably have gotten to this stage. And that is when we get to burnout. Burnout in a relationship is horrendous, particularly when you're engaging with an avoidant attacher. This is when, as I mentioned earlier, those feelings of loneliness, resentment, start to build into depression. You start to get to a point where you just feel miserable. You start to feel like, you're just not a very fun person to be around. And you may be questioning whether or not you actually have a depressive disorder, whether there's some form of trauma that's impacted you and caused you to be this way. Maybe it's just that time of the month for some of us. Maybe it's retrograde. Who knows what it may be. But this is a phase marked by a lot of intense emotions and feeling just so low and also so distant from your partner that you may start to personalize things. You may start to think, oh, it's all me. I'm the one who's causing everyone to be unhappy. You may even go to a lot of mental health professionals who aren't really able to see the root cause of what you're going through. So this is where I'm going to say things now, which is your relationship can actually be a catalyst for serious mental health issues if you are not careful. And if you have a lot of unaddressed emotions that are causing this, then it can have a serious impact on not only your mental and emotional well-being, but also your physical well-being. I have gone on live many times talking about the physical consequences and the ailments that can cause us huge grief when we're in a very high stress relational dynamic where we're not getting our emotional needs met. This can cause many chronic health issues, which I won't detail now because I've talked about them enough. But all I'm here to say is if you've reached this point, you might be at a point where you're actually at a stage where it's, you might want to leave the relationship. This is where I need to make a very important PSA for everyone who's dating someone who's a fearful avoidant or even a dismissive avoidant, which is if you declare that you are going to potentially leave the relationship, what may happen for the avoidant attacher is they start to exhibit very anxious-like behavior. They may start to become needy, saying things like, no, don't leave, I love you, don't know what I'd do without you if you were to leave me, and they become almost quite needy. It is in this particular moment where I need to make it very clear that an avoidant attacher is nigh unlikely to change their behavior due to a fear of intimacy, meaning that if they're the ones to break away from you because they feel, oh, this is too much for me. I feel like I'm engulfed. I'm losing my independence. All the fears and rationalizations that I talk about. Often they justify that and go, yeah, I made the right decision. But if they feel like they're losing you and the pain of abandonment comes up for them, I'm here to tell you this is where things can start to take a huge shift. But you only get to this stage under very specific circumstances. So I'm going to lay it out. You, the person dating this avoidant attacher, have reached the point of no return. You're burnt out, you don't care about this relationship, and you're ready to leave. This is when you need to be very mindful of what happens next. If you choose to set very, big boundaries around this, and also maybe even ultimatums, which I'll get into in just a hot second, you need to be prepared for what's potentially going to come up. The avoidant attacher is not going to like this. They may, in a dismissive avoidance sense, say things like, well, I was not enjoying this relationship anyways, so I guess if we're going to break up now, it's not going to make much of a difference. That might be in their moment their way of coping with the distress of actually this breakup occurring, because I can tell you now, they will be in massive agony if you choose to leave and walk. I want to make it very clear that like children, you need to be very good at setting consequences for their actions. If nothing changes and your mental and emotional well-being is such that the other person is controlling this relationship through their emotions and you're just continuing to feel like everything is on their terms, that you can't even continue to progress things because it causes them too much instability, then you need to be bloody careful of where you're at. So at this particular point, if you commit to leaving, you commit to leaving. You're not there to commit them to try and get them to therapy. You've done that. You're not there to hope that they might spin back around and change. They could, and hopefully they go to therapy on their own volition. But at this point, your priority is you and your well-being. You commit to going, and that's it. There is no going back at this particular point in time. Maybe you can review things in 6 months or a year if they've actually shown signs of wanting to work on their stuff. But I'm not here to talk about that particular stage. Today, I'm here to say, if you're going to set boundaries around this, you need to be very good at following up on that. Otherwise, you're just going to enable more of the behavior and it's not going to get better. So let's talk about when things go from healthy communication into we need to start taking some drastic action here, communication. In a post that I did a little while ago, I was talking about the need to have rigid boundaries and ultimatums with avoidant attachers. And it's very circumstantial. I don't recommend you do this with, at any stage, because it's not, the goal is not to set ultimatums. That's a very unhealthy thing to do in general context. But there is one where it's actually at a point where it's like, I think we've gotten to that stage. So the thing here is to understand that if you're going to do this, let's just say you're both, you and your avoidant partner with your family are trying to get, closer to actually work on, say, getting married together, moving in together. And the avoidant partner is starting to have a shutdown episode where they're like, this is too much. I think I could just leave. I don't want to be here anymore. This is very threatening, especially when you've come this far. And this is when you might need to say to the avoidant partner, listen, I understand you're going through a lot of distress right now, but this level of distress has a significant impact on me, and leaving me and the kids right now is not okay, and I do not have the bandwidth to do that. So if this is going to happen, I will leave you and I will not be reaching out to you because I need to protect myself, because I cannot put up with having a partner who's not here to support me through this experience. Might sound harsh, but bear in mind the context. You've had a few conversations around this leading up to this point. It's not the first time you've been at this rodeo. At this particular point, we're not here to, as we say in Australia, fuck spiders. We're here to now start having some very clear lines of communication and consequence where it's like, we're done having healthy communication. We're done with the boundaries. We're done trying to communicate this appropriately. We need to now actually start having some very radical responsibility. Otherwise, I'm out because I can't put up with this anymore. In this particular moment, there are a few things that can happen. The avoidant partner will bounce because they don't want to face that, and that might be it. Adios. They're not coming back. But in other circumstances, they may continue to still, hold their ground and not budge much, and you might have to just be like, right, I'm pulling the plug. And it's no less devastating as it would be if they'd abruptly broken up with you. It is so devastating to end these situationships and relationships much of the time. And for you, even though on one hand you might be like, I knew I was doing the right thing, it can be traumatizing and devastating to have to do this to someone who, frankly, may actually be a very good person at heart, but just cannot get it together to be in a romantic relationship. It's never easy to have these conversations. It's never easy to be the one where you've got to be like, I've got to pull the plug for my own benefit and well-being. Sometimes these individuals, will often be in such a state of depression. Actually, not sometimes, they will usually always be this way. They'll usually be in such a state of depression that they may want to do something about it. They may reach out to you. They may also go to therapy about it. They may do a range of different things. But the key point that I just want to say is that at this particular moment, it's all on you to protect yourself and your well-being. You've got to be very careful of your mental health. And I've seen way too many long-term relationships where people, particularly angst attachers, really do not speak up enough for themselves in this experience. And it can be devastating because they've let a situationship or relationship run the best of them. And in some cases, I've heard some of them go on for as long as 20 years. And that's even situationships. So that's why I'm here to tell you that if your fear is keeping you in a position where you don't feel like you can speak up for yourself, you really need to speak to someone and actually start working through this, because it's not healthy for you at all. Even if that person is not a bad person, the fact of the matter is their behavior is having a huge consequence on your well-being. So that's pretty much the stages of communication that I wanted to convey with someone who's avoidantly attached. Once again, I actually think a lot of avoidant attachers are phenomenal human beings. I think that they can be really, really great partners if they're able to work through their stuff. I've heard plenty of accounts where it's able to work out when that avoidant attacher has enough humility, accountability, and a good accountability team to help them out with any of their triggers and their flare-ups. However, if they don't have all those things in place and they also are still very much an adolescent emotionally and also aren't in a place of rock bottom where they're willing to change, you can be the most amazing partner in the world and they're still not going to change for you. The fact of the matter is that, they only change when they're ready to and when they're in enough pain. And if you think that being the most incredible communicator, the healthiest person, is going to give them that sense that they need to do something about it, nope, it doesn't work like that. So Just want to round out this little piece before I go into Q&A and say, be mindful of the stage at which you're at when you're communicating with these people. Please, as I said with that last phase, you're only doing that when you've reached that point of no return. You're not doing that to try and get a raise out of these people. And lastly, one last thing that I want to say is delineating fearful avoidance and also dismissives here. The context of what I've described in that last segment may apply to both dismissives and fearful avoidance, but if you are dating someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style, particularly fearful, where they're doing that boomerang style, having a cycle with you, abruptly ending, coming back, breaking up with you, and so on and so on, you are in a very, very, very addictive relationship at that particular point, and you need to have very firm boundaries with your partner. You may need to say, hey, listen, babe, I love you, but these cycles are really hurting me, and I need to start actually stepping back for my own well-being. It doesn't mean I don't want to maybe see you. It just means that I need to start putting myself first, because every time we go through this, it just kills my soul, and I need to protect myself. So that's why I want to make it very clear that if you're engaging with that kind of dynamic, you're going to need to do things very differently, because being in the addictive loop with a fearful avoidant who's coming back and forth, I'd actually argue is a lot harder at times for people to get themselves to a place of feeling more grounded than you would be if you're just with someone who's maybe more dismissive avoidant inclined. They could still be fearful avoidant, but someone who's basically still in the relationship where you just feel that loneliness in it. So that's what I wanted to say there. Anyways, that's my little TED Talk wrapped up for today. Let's dive into Q&A. Thank you very much, as always, for listening and having a chat about this. All right. Do all avoidants date and or hook up right after a relationship? My fearful avoidant ex hasn't dated anyone, and it's been a year, but he definitely threw himself into work. Not necessarily. So I've seen this go many ways. If they say to you things like at the end, oh yeah, I don't think I'm going to look for a relationship off the back of this, believe them in that moment. However, when a lot of that shutdown episode has passed, what happens off the back of that is then all that intense emotion often returns, where they feel longing for you, they feel sad, they feel like a piece of shit, they feel guilty and shame for what they've done. So one of many things could happen. They double down in work, they have a burnout episode, they end up looking for a new person to make them feel better. They may actually have a sex binge episode where they start having lots of casual sex to make them feel better. So it is quite common for them to do a range of things to get away from the intensity of the breakup, whether they were the ones to cause it or you were the one who was causing it by being like, nah, we're done. So that's why it's really important to be mindful that they have a way, like a lot of their coping mechanisms start to come into full play around that point. Is it just me, or are avoidants are super good at opening up about their trauma initially? I've talked to many people on dating apps, and I could never say I've dated them, even though combos often go very deep. Do they just want a therapist, or do they actually have feelings for me? Oh, great question. So I want to make a claim here and say, not every avoidant attacher will do that. It's very hyper or hypo. You'll often get some avoidant attachers, particularly dismissives, who are so guarded about their past that if you even go there, they often have like a flare-up incident and they're just like, well, why would we want to discuss this? And they can become very angry and hypervigilant. But then on the flip side, typically the fearful avoidants in my experience are massive trauma dumpers. And I think a lot of them do this because this is their way of relating to people. This is their way of trying to connect with people. And on the receiving end of it, you might think to yourself, oh my God, it feels so good that this person actually values me enough to actually share all this really vulnerable stuff that they're going through in life with their current romantic partner, their family. And I'm here to tell you, it's their relational style. It does not mean they necessarily see you as someone who's supposed to be the love of their life. And often this can often be a symptom of the fact that they have poor boundaries or have been modeled poor boundaries with people that they've grown up with before. So in this particular context, doesn't mean they valued you. I think if the fact that you're an approachable human being who also allowed them the space to talk about this stuff, I'd say on one hand, absolutely. Take it with a sign of, take that as a green flag that, you seem like someone who's actually willing to listen to their stuff. That's a beautiful trait to have. Hell, it's great for any relationship. So that's one thing. Two, I think if you feel like they did actually have some underlying feelings for you, then I think that's important to acknowledge. And then finally, do you think they're looking for a therapist? My answer is, I think without realizing it, they probably are. But whether they're actually aware enough to the point of realizing I need to change and actually go and do some work with someone is entirely up in the air. So That's unfortunately the way it rolls. If you call out the distance and they take forever to respond, but say things are fine, but they're willing to talk, is it worth it to do considering they haven't tried to change their distant behavior? All right, so maybe let's make an example out of this. Let's say you've been dating someone now for a few months and they start distancing from you, and you don't hear from them for 2 weeks, even though they come back to you after 2 weeks saying, yeah, oh, sorry, I was in a dark place. Yeah, everything's fine now. I'm happy to talk. They've been dating you for 9 months, and then, I think I said 9 months earlier, 9 months, and they've decided to do this without involving you beforehand, and now they're just like, oh yeah, everything's fine, happy to talk. They have come back to you without even acknowledging how they must have impacted you and also what's gone on. That's not okay. That's really not okay. And I think a lot of people would actually feel quite angry because it's like, well, where the fuck have you been? What have you been doing this entire time? Sometimes, of course, if you're going through a depressive episode, you might not want to include people. But I think if you really are, if you're dating someone and you're concerned about the impact of your actions, it's okay to be like, listen, I'm just going through a bit of a funk right now. I'll get back to you in a little bit, but, I'm just leave me for a little bit and I'll come right back to you. I think it's really important to bear in mind that if you're in this particular example, I would, if it were me personally, it would have to, I'd probably be at a stage where I'm like, we really need to have a chat about this because you can't just, distance yourself like that from me because without knowing about it, it really hurts me. So I think that's totally fine to bring that up. Also, circling back to what I said at the beginning of the live, talking about triggers, that is not that may bring up triggers for you, granted, but it also is a hurtful thing to do. I think people get it twisted. They think that being triggered means you're being hurt. And on one hand, I'd say, that's not entirely accurate. A trigger in isolation may be something that's from the past that's coming up that needs to be addressed, but triggers and, being hurt by someone can coexist at the same time. This might have done two things to you. You could have triggers of previous abandonment that you've had, whilst also simultaneously feeling hurt by the absence your partner has created. That is a perfectly legitimate thing to share with your partner because they've done something to deliberately hurt you. So just want to put it out there and say, great question, but I think it depends on the context. But a conversation definitely needs to be had because you can't just unilaterally decide to back out like that without involving your partner. How to stay away and stay strong when a fearful avoidant returns. I've been in a rinse and repeat for over a year. He always comes back stronger than before and I take the bait, struggling to untangle myself. Great question. I think that one thing to bear in mind in a situation like that where it sounds like the fearful avoidant attacher is very glued to you, and then when they feel that abandonment, they start to, come back stronger and harder than ever. I don't like doing such things like, say, breaking off things completely, because I think that can be really hard on your nervous system and it can also cause you to backpedal really quickly. I think being more gradual is the way to go about it. So in my experience, what that might mean is, investing less time with this person, not communicating as much with this person, maybe not replying as quickly as you used to, giving it a few more hours, days before you reply to these individuals, setting boundaries with them, saying things like, hey, I'll get back to you in a couple of weeks when I'm a bit more emotionally present, because at the moment I could say something that I don't want to say to you and I want to just take my time for myself. It's those little baby steps for taking the time to just sort of reduce the amount of interaction you have with this person, so that way you're not in such an addictive loop. And if they come back harder than ever before, you might need to set stronger boundaries with them, saying, look, I can't respond to you right now, and if you do, I will have to mute or at worst block you if this continues. So I think it's really important, again, going back to what I said earlier about, rigid boundaries, ultimatums. If you're at a stage where it's starting to affect your mental health, I gotta tell you, you've really got to start, putting yourself first in that situation. I am a fearful avoidant situationship ex dating a dismissive avoidant for 5 months and look, whoa. Oh, here we go. Fearful avoidant situationship ex is dating a dismissive avoidant for 5 months and looks happy. How to deal with the pain? Well, it depends, I think, on the pain that you're feeling. I think a lot of people would, if they saw their ex was dating someone new, it can often make them feel betrayed, hurt, and it can also bring in a lot of doubt, make you wonder, did this person actually have an avoidant attachment style? Are they actually, not looking for a relationship? Was I the problem? I think that, the key thing I'd say there is it's really important to work through your inner critic that might be blaming you for what you've gone through at that particular moment, because it's very easy to start making conclusions like, oh, I must have been the problem if they're doing this. No, not necessarily. That could be their way of dealing with the breakup as they move forward without processing their feelings. I think that the other thing too is to acknowledge that you are hurt by this behavior. I'd also recommend speaking to someone because that's intense. And I think it is one of those things where it's okay to admit, I've been really blindsided and betrayed by this person, but I can't work through this myself. That's my personal hot take on it because, the betrayal of these experiences is hell. Let's see, what else have we got here? A month after BU and no contact. I'm not sure what BU stands for. Ex went to Reddit to lament about his ex from 6 years ago. Why? Is BU supposed to be burnt out? I can't tell what that is, but I'll answer the second part. Ex went to Reddit to lament about his ex from 6 years ago. Why? It's a deactivating strategy. It's the whole thing with regards to the phantom ex. Many individuals who are avoidantly attached, one of their deactivating strategies is to start ruminating on a previous relationship and also to start waxing lyrically about it. I'll break up. Thank you. My brain today. It's Monday for me, for those of you that are in the other side of the planet. I'm just slowly getting into gear with stuff. But with regards to being in Phantom X land, it's very normal for a lot of avoidant attachers to, when they're not feeling happy in a relationship, to wax lyrically about a previous ex that they've had. So in that context, it's quite normal for that to happen. Does it mean that they're meant to be together? No. Much of this stuff is coming from a place of nostalgia, and it's part of their way of dealing with the distress that they're feeling inside a relationship. Think about it like this. Many people who are bored in life often fantasize about a fantasy life that they want to be a part of, have someone save them. If you are feeling a lot of emotional distress, and I mean, I'm talking about just anybody here, not someone with particular attachment style issues. You know, when you are emotionally dysregulated and you're bored with life, and you are probably someone with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, it is so easy to not be grounded in reality, to be unhappy with all these feelings that are coming up for you. So fantasies often represent a way of, helping us meet unmet needs in a fantastical setting, but it also may be an escape from pain that you're feeling in the present that you haven't resolved or worked through yet. So that's why that might be happening. Let's keep going. I think I've done that one. How do I handle seeing my fearful avoidant ex with a new girl? He's come back every time I've gone no contact, coming to me in parties, wanting to hold me. Even with his new person who's at the same party. Had to tell him to stay away. I think my answer to that is very similar to one that I answered a little earlier, which is I think you definitely need to speak to someone to sort of help you work through that. But I also think too, one thing to look at this a bit objectively is, why the hell is this guy playing the field like that? That's not okay. You're essentially with a guy who's, indecisive about you and this other girl that he's now with. How do you think that feels? Like, that's pretty hurtful. I personally wouldn't be a fan of that kind of behavior, and I can understand the confusion because on one hand it might seem like, well, he seems like he's still really into me, and to which I'm going to say he probably is. But just because he's still into you doesn't make this behavior okay. So please bear in mind, it's very easy, I think, to look at this as like, oh, well, maybe there's some hope here or there's something here. No, there is no hope in a lot of those kind of dynamics. This person's being childish and they're not being fair to you and also to your experience with this too. Oh, I saw a really good question here. How to trust when moving into dating again? How do I explain my wariness to new potential daters? Okay, great question. I actually had to go through this a while ago, and I found what really helped for me was I just said, hey, listen, I just need to let you know, when I'm dating at the moment, I'm still sort of a little bit shaky off the back of some previous experiences. I'm not into my ex, I'm totally beyond them, but I am just feeling a bit wobbly. I'd like to just take things a bit slow and just, really focus on consistency because that really matters to me. I'll be honest, my walls were as high as the Great Wall of China for much of those stages of dating, and I did push people away because I was like, this just does not feel good. But I needed that. It was important to have that experience of pushing people away at times or just, feeling safe in my body to stand up for myself and have boundaries because it's really important to protect yourself. I can see someone here has asked best dating apps. Honestly, I think they're all the same at the end of the day. I mean, if you're part of the LGBT community, I'd stay away from the ones that are particularly sex-focused, like Grindr. Maybe that's Tinder if you're part of this heterosexual space. But I found Hinge is often better. But to be completely honest, the kinds of people on there, they're all the same at the end of the day in my experience, meaning that you're going to get different segments of people who are ready for a relationship, who are not ready for a relationship. I think it's really the app that's most comfortable for you and how you use it that matters. Let's see, what else have we got here? Boyfriend keeps threatening to leave recently because he's overwhelmed with work. Says he can't just give me what I deserve right now. Just went out of town without telling me and admits he's running scared. I offered to end it since he won't, but then he backpedals and says we should still think about things. Says he's in love with me and sees a future but doesn't have the emotional bandwidth right now. Oh God, that's a terrible situation to be in. I'm assuming, okay, this is a point that I wanted to make that I didn't have a chance to talk about earlier. It is so easy for anxious attachers to acquiesce in these moments and be like, oh, well, maybe we should break up to try and please your partner. I'm going to give you a bit of tough love from someone who was in this situation and just say it as it is. There is no acquiescing in these particular cases. For this particular person, I'm sorry that you're in this situation because it's hell, but I just want to say one of the toughest lessons we have to learn is we cannot put up with someone who's constantly threatening to blow up a relationship when it gets scary. That's so destructive to so many parts of ourselves, least of which is our mental health. I just want to say, if you're in this situation, the way I'd handle it now is be like, okay, I'm out. Like, I'm not dealing with this. I can't go through an experience where I feel like my life and my emotional well-being is basically being held in the hands of someone who's constantly threatening and making me feel like a hostage in this relationship. It's not fair to me. I'm not going to go through it. So we're either committing to this or I'm out. Because those of us that have gone through a breakup like this know the intensity of the pain of what that causes us. Frankly, I am never going to go through an experience like that again. I just refuse. I could, but the point is I know how to handle it, but I refuse to be in a position where I'm subjugated to that because someone is being hot and cold like that. It is not healthy. So that's why I'm at a stage where I can say something like that. But if you're in a position like this and you haven't gone through this, I think that's going to be a problem in terms of navigating out of that, because you might be coming from more of a place of how can I help you feel better? They're not open to working through it from the sounds of it, so probably not going to help. Let's see what else have we got here. Staying friends with a dismissive avoidant after a 2.5-year situationship, yes or no? Does it help or best to go no contact? I mean, in my experience, it's better to go no contact because you need that time to heal and process your feelings. I'd probably be in contact with my ex like years after the fact if I wanted to get back in touch with them. The reason being that I know it's hard if this is your first time going through a situation like this to not want to let go because you've had such a great connection. But as I said before, great connections are not worth the price of seeing someone who you want to be with be a friend. When you had love for that person, you don't want to see a downgrade in your relationship like that. So personally, I would say no. But this is your journey and it's entirely up to you to figure out what feels best for you, even though I know it's bloody hard to make a decision at this stage. I can see here someone says, my ex ended things out of nowhere. She said because work is really busy and he knows what the outcome will be. I was and I'm still in complete shock. How to get over this? I think that the best way to get over this is to acknowledge the fact that it's not going to be easy to get over this. You've been betrayed, traumatized, and also are in a state where you're probably in a lot of pain. You're probably at the stage 1 of this, which is the shock phase. You'll eventually hit anger and then a few other stages. But I think the thing I'm going to just say, obviously without doing a session, via Instagram Live, is to say, I think you just need to sit with the shock and also get educated on this sort of stuff because having an experience like that is so devastating to your nervous system. Man, it's probably going to take you a while to recover off the back of this. But the more you educate yourself on this, the more you work through this, you will feel whole again and you will feel better. But it's really important to understand that. Someone here has asked, can you tell whether someone is dismissive avoidant? Actually, one last thing on that last question before I answer the next one I was starting to read. I'd actually be honest and say you probably need to speak to someone because it's very hard to work through an emotional breakup like that. It's really rough. Can you tell whether someone is a dismissive avoidant versus a fearful avoidant on how they describe their childhood? No. And to be honest, this is where things become really confusing because in my experience, we can all have come from a similar background, but we may develop in such different ways. And so, for instance, I could have come from a neglectful household, and yet me and my sibling might have gone in such divergent routes in terms of our attachment style. I could have come from an enmeshed household, my sibling could have too, and yet again, our attachment styles could be completely different. There are so many other things to contextualize too. Like I'm questioning also whether or not there's a biological component to this in terms of our tendency to go one way or the other. But that aside, if we look at just the conventional literature, they would say, what's your schooling history been like? Friends, romantic relationships. I think their childhood in isolation wouldn't really show you those overt signs, which I think actually the behavior, their past relationship history, probably going to show you more. In my experience, fearful avoidants tend to be they tend to be very good at focusing on issues of rights, self-justice, and I was going to say self-righteous, but they also focus on justice. Whereas dismissive avoidants tend to be a bit more cool, collected, and also have more of a disposition of high rationality, and also being more removed from a lot of issues that are going on in their lives. They just see things very black and white in terms of the way they approach things. I mean, that's a very shallow description of the distinction, but I think the way they behave in a relationship when you get to know them can really start to tell the difference. One key thing is, I'd say the dismissive avoidants tend to view themselves with superficial self-esteem, whereas fearful avoidants tend to do the complete opposite, where they tend to be very self-deprecating. So that's something I've noticed, which is different. I'm going to answer one more, and then I'm going to call it a day because your boy's got to do things for work. Let's see, what's another one here? Here's a good one. Why would a dismissive avoidant ex deliberately walk past me several times at a bar and sit on the table next to me but not speak to me? That can be a combination of things. My interpretation of that would be that it is probably a case where, on one hand, they probably are feeling, a mixed range of emotions. One of it could be fondness for you, but on the other hand, it could be a lot of shame, guilt for their past actions. So their way of protecting themselves from the intensity of their emotions is, on one hand, being close to you, but not close enough to the point where they continue to feel such intense emotions around you. And many of them do blank and also act like they don't know you, because it really does bring up a lot of discomfort for them. It's very hard for them to face what they've done, meaning the breakup they've created, because they realize, I think a lot of them do, that they've actually contributed to this and they don't like feeling like a bad person. I'm going to do a live soon talking about the ego of avoidant attachers and how they need to be a good person, because it's very common for this sort of behavior to happen. And I want to say it's not done with maliciousness or the intention to make you feel bad, but I think it's really important that, I think it's really important just to be mindful that context matters, and we also don't know what this person's feeling in the moment. But generally speaking, if they are blanking you or not engaging with you, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't like you. It could just be because they've got a lot of discomfort. In any case, I'm going to round out here. Thank you everyone for joining this live about communicating with people with an avoidant attachment. I have to be honest and say, the tips that I've given here can be applied to people with anxious attachment as well too. But there are obviously distinctions and differences we must think about for people who have an avoidant attachment, because the way they go through this is not the same as the way a lot of us anxious or even secure folk go through things. So please bear in mind that just because we would behave one way does not mean that another person will behave in the same way. I will now post this so you can watch this at your leisure. And thanks again, everyone, for being part of this experience.